The Mender of Ruins Part 1. The Crack in the Wall. The heat in Capernaum did not sit on the skin, it burrowed. It lived in the dust that coated the throat, in the smell of drying fish guts rotting on the shore, and in the heavy, restless silence of men who had too much time and too little silver. Caleb sat in the shadow of a limestone wall that was slowly crumbling. He knew it was crumbling because he had watched the hairline fracture in the mortar widen over the last 3 hours. He was a man who understood how things broke. It was his trade, or it had been, before the wine took the steadiness from his hands and the guilt took the sleep from his eyes. He took a drink from the clay flask. The wine was sour, watered down with vinegar. But it dulled the ache in his left shoulder, souvenir from a Roman gladius during a riot he had no business fighting in. "You look like a statue that's been tipped over," a voice rasped. Caleb didn't look up. He knew the voice. Yakin, a beggar who had lost his legs to frostbite in the Syrian mountains years ago. "Statues have value, Yakin," Caleb muttered, his eyes still fixed on the crack in the wall. "Go away." "There is a crowd gathering near the customs house," Yakin said, ignoring the dismissal. He shifted his weight on his wooden cart. "They say the Nazarene is back from the wilderness." Caleb scoffed, a dry, cracking sound in his chest. "Another magician, another shouter, claiming the end is nigh. If I had a shekel for every Messiah who walked through these gates, I could buy the Tetrarch's palace." "This one is different," Yakin insisted. "He doesn't shout. Then he won't be heard." Caleb closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the warm stone. Behind his eyelids, the darkness wasn't black, it was the color of dust. It was the memory of a collapsing roof, the scream of timber giving way. And the silence that followed. That was the only silence that mattered. The silence of a house that used to hold a family and now held nothing but air. He took another drink. The liquid burned, but not enough. "I need you to move," a rough voice barked from above. Caleb opened one eye. A Roman auxiliary, armor dull with grime, stood over him. Behind the soldier, a merchant's cart was wedged in the narrow alley. "The street is wide enough," Caleb said evenly. "Not for the timber I'm hauling," the merchant shouted from the driver's seat. "Get this filth out of the way." The soldier kicked Caleb's boot. "Move now." Caleb felt the familiar heat rise in his chest, not the sun, but the old, dangerous rage. He looked at the soldier's greaves, then at the weak point in the leather strap holding them. He looked at the merchant's cart, noting the stress on the left wheel axle. He saw the breaking points. He always saw the breaking points. Slowly, heavily, Caleb stood. He was a large man, broad in the shoulder, with a beard matted with gray and eyes that looked like they had stared into a furnace. The soldier took a subtle step back, hand hovering near his hilt. Caleb didn't fight. He didn't have the energy. He simply stepped aside, into the deeper recess of the alley. "Go," he grunted. The cart rumbled past. As the left wheel hit a pothole, the axle groaned a sound like a dying animal. But it held. Caleb watched it go, disappointed. He wanted to see it break. He wanted the outside world to look like the inside of his head. Night fell, bringing no relief from the heat, only a change in the quality of the shadows. Caleb found work hauling nets for a fisherman named Simon. A loud, brash man who smelled of the lake and frantic energy. Simon was distracted tonight, his eyes darting toward the town center. "You're slow today, Mason," Simon snapped, though there was no real malice in it. "My brother says he's at Peter's house. The courtyard is overflowing." "Who?" Caleb asked, coiling a wet, heavy rope. His hands were raw. "The teacher, Jesus." Simon said the name as if tasting a strange fruit. Sweet, but with a pit that might break a tooth. "They say he touched a leper yesterday. Actually touched him, skin to skin." Caleb paused. "Then he is unclean, and a fool." "The leper is clean now, Caleb. Skin like a child's." Caleb dropped the rope. It hit the wooden deck with a wet thud. "Lepers don't get clean, Simon. Walls crack, roofs fall, flesh rots. That is the way of things. Do not be a child." Simon stopped working. He wiped his hands on his tunic, his expression suddenly serious. "Come and see. Just come and see. I have seen enough." "What do you have to do tonight, Caleb?" "Drink until you forget her name. Sit in the dirt." Simon's voice was low, cutting. "Come." Caleb wanted to strike him. But the mention of her, of his wife, Sarah, sapped the strength from his arms. He followed Simon, not out of hope, but out of a need to prove the fisherman wrong. To see the fraud. To see the crack in the facade. The streets were choked. It seemed the entirety of Capernaum had poured itself into the narrow lanes surrounding the house. There were torches sputtering in the humid air, casting long, dancing shadows against the whitewashed walls. The noise was a physical weight, the weeping of the sick, the desperate pleas of beggars, the hushed arguments of scribes. Caleb used his size to plow a path, his shoulder checking men aside. He felt nothing but contempt. Look at them, he thought. Desperate sheep waiting to be sheared. They reached the edge of the courtyard. It was impossible to get closer. People were pressed shoulder to shoulder, a wall of humanity. We can't get in, Caleb said, satisfied. Hush, Simon hissed. A hush was rippling through the crowd, starting from the center and moving outward like a wave. It wasn't the silence of fear, but the silence of sudden arresting attention. Caleb craned his neck. He was tall enough to see over the heads of the weeping women in front of him. In the center of the courtyard, a space had cleared. There was no throne, no golden aura, no shouting prophet tearing his robes. There was just a man sitting on a low stone bench. He wore a simple tunic, woven without a seam, dust on the hem. He looked ordinary. He didn't look like a king, he looked like a laborer. But then the man looked up. For a second, just a heartbeat, Caleb felt the breath leave his lungs. The man wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at a paralyzed man lying on a mat at his feet. The paralyzed man was shaking, terrified. The teacher reached out. His hand was not the soft hand of a priest. It was calloused, broad, the hand of a man who knew the bite of a chisel and the weight of a beam. A builder's hand. Caleb watched, mesmerized by the hand. Rise, the teacher said. He didn't shout it. He didn't chant an incantation. He said it with the casual authority of a man telling the sun to rise in the morning. The man on the mat twitched. A gasp tore through the crowd. A leg straightened, then the other. The paralyzed man pushed himself up, his limbs trembling not with weakness, but with the shock of new strength. Caleb felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. Trickery, his mind screamed. It has to be. But his builder's eyes saw the mechanics of it. He saw the atrophy in the man's legs, the wasted muscle suddenly fill. He saw the structure It was physically impossible, yet it was happening 5 paces away. The crowd erupted. Shouts, prayers, weeping. The noise was deafening. But in the center of the chaos, the teacher remained still. He didn't smile in triumph. He didn't play to the crowd. He looked burdened. Then, as if drawn by a wire, the teacher's head turned. His eyes cut through the torchlight, through the press of body. Over the heads of the weeping women. They locked onto Caleb. The eyes were dark, like deep water. They were not judging, they were not angry. They were startlingly clear. In them, Caleb saw no deception and no deifying, absolute knowing. It was as if those eyes had walked through the ruins of Caleb's house, stepped over the broken timbers, and sat down in the ashes of his life. The teacher held his gaze for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Caleb felt an urge he hadn't felt in 5 years. The urge to weep. He panicked. The feeling was alien, dangerous. Caleb tore his eyes away. He shoved Simon back. "Let me out," Caleb rasped, his voice trembling. "I need air." "Caleb, did you see?" "Let me out." He turned and bulldozed his way through the crowd, ignoring the curses of those he trampled. He ran until the noise of the miracle faded into a dull roar behind him. He ran until he reached the lake, where the water lapped black and indifferent against the stones. He fell to his knees in the sand, his chest heaving. He looked at his own hands. They were shaking. He grabbed a stone and hurled it into the water. "It's a trick," he whispered to the darkness. "It's all a trick." But the image of the builder's hand reaching out, and the terrifying clarity of those eyes, would not leave him. The crack in his wall had just gotten wider. 2 days passed. Caleb avoided the town center. He took work repairing a retaining wall in the vineyards, up on the hills, far from the harbor. The physical labor was a bum. The ache in his muscles drowned out the noise in his head. He was fitting a jagged piece of basalt into the wall, when he heard footsteps on the gravel path. He didn't turn. "I have no water for travelers. Keep moving." "I am not thirsty for water." The voice was soft, melodic, but carrying an undercurrent of steel. Caleb froze. He knew the voice. He had heard it say, "Rise." Slowly, Caleb turned, the heavy stone still gripped in his hands like a weapon. The teacher was standing there. He was alone, which was strange. The crowds usually swarmed him like flies on honey. He wore a heavy woolen cloak against the wind coming off the hills. Up close, he looked tired. There were circles under his eyes. "You are the Mason," Jesus said. It wasn't a question. Caleb lowered the stone but didn't drop it. "And you are the magician." Jesus smiled, a small, fleeting thing that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He walked over to the wall Caleb was building. He ran a hand over the rough stone. "Basalt," Jesus said. "Hard to work, unforgiving. But if you set the cornerstone right, it will outlast the empire." "What do you want?" Caleb asked, his voice harsh. "I have no coin. I have no sickness I want you to touch. I am not one of your sheep." Jesus turned from the wall and looked at Caleb. The wind whipped the hem of his robe. "I know," Jesus said. "You are the one who thinks the ruins are safer than the house." Caleb flinched. The stone slipped from his fingers and thudded into the dirt, narrowly missing his boot. "You don't know me." "I know that you carry a weight that is heavier than that stone," Jesus said, stepping closer. He didn't invade Caleb's space, yet his presence felt encompassing. "I saw you at the window of the crowd. You ran." "I have no patience for hysteria." "You have no patience for hope," Jesus corrected him gently. "Because you think hope is a lie." "You think that if you hope again, the roof will fall again." Caleb's breath hitched. The air on the hill suddenly felt very thin. "My wife," he choked out. "The beam, I built it." "I built the house. It was my calculation, my hand." He held up his trembling hands. These hands killed her. The silence stretched between them, vast and aching. A hawk cried out somewhere high above. Jesus reached out. He took Caleb's rough, dirt-stained hands in his own. Jesus' grip was firm, warm, and startlingly real. "These are hands that build, Caleb," Jesus said. "You built a tomb for yourself out of your guilt. You have been living in it for 5 years." Caleb tried to pull away, but he couldn't. He looked into the teacher's face and saw a sorrow so deep it seemed to encompass the whole world. Yet within that sorrow was a fierce, burning light. "The house fell," Jesus whispered. "But you are still here. And the foundation is not dust. I am the foundation." He released Caleb's hands. "I am building something, Caleb. Not of stone, not of cedar. I am building a kingdom where the broken are the cornerstones, where the mourners are the first to be comforted." Jesus stepped back. He looked at the half-finished wall. "Finish your work," Jesus said. "Do it well. And when you are done with the stone, come find me. I have a heavier load for you to carry. But this one, you will not carry alone." Jesus turned and began to walk back down the path, his cloak billowing behind him. Caleb stood rooted to the spot. He looked at his hands. For the first time in years, they were steady. He looked at the wall. He picked up the stone he had dropped. He placed it into the gap. It fit perfectly. "Who are you?" Caleb whispered to the wind. But he already knew the answer. The question wasn't who the man was. The question was who Caleb would be when the sun went down. The road to Jerusalem was a scar cut into the limestone hills, bleached white by a merciless sun. Caleb walked at the rear of the procession, a straggler in the dust of the 12 men who clung closest to the teacher. Weeks had bled into months. Caleb had finished the wall in the vineyards, packed his tools in a rough canvas sack, and simply started walking. He didn't call himself a disciple. He was a shadow. He fetched water when the skins were dry. He moved rocks from the path so the teacher wouldn't stumble. He slept on the edge of the camp, listening to the murmuring of Peter and John, listening to the silence of Jesus. Jerusalem loomed like a fortress of gold and paranoia. The city was swelling for the feast, a hive of nervous energy. Roman pylons glinted on the Antonia fortress, watching the temple courts like hawkeyes. Caleb hated the city. It smelled of politics and old blood. They entered the temple courts on a Tuesday, the air thick with the smoke of burnt offerings. Caleb stayed close to a pillar, his mason's eye noting the grandeur of Herod's construction. Massive stones, fitted so tightly a knife blade couldn't pass between them. Impressive, he thought, but cold. It has no pulse. The confrontation happened near the treasury. A mob had gathered, a swirling eddy of shouting men and flying dust. They were dragging a woman. Her clothes were torn, her hair a veil across a face contorted in terror. "Adulteress," a Pharisee screamed, his voice cracking with self-righteous fury. Caught in the very act. Caleb felt his muscles lock. He knew the weight of a stone. He knew what it did to human bone. He saw the men in the circle bending down, their fingers curling around jagged rocks. He saw the lust for violence disguised as the law. They threw the woman at Jesus' feet. She hit the pavement hard, a bundle of shame. "Teacher," the Pharisee sneered. Testing the trap. "Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" The air went rigid. If Jesus said no, he defied Moses. If he said yes, he defied Rome. And he defied his own message of mercy. Caleb stepped forward, his hand instinctively going to the small hammer in his belt. He didn't know why. But he wanted to stand between the mob and the teacher. Jesus did not speak. He did not look at the woman, nor at the accusers. He bent down. The builder's hand, the hand that had knit the paralytic's legs, reached out, but not to heal. One finger extended. Jesus began to write in the dust of the temple floor. The silence stretched, agonizing and heavy. The only sound was the scratch of finger against grit. Caleb craned his neck. He couldn't read the words, but he saw the posture. It was dismissive. It reduced the baying mob to nothing more than background noise. Let any one of you who is without sin, Jesus said, his voice low, not looking up from the dust, be the first to throw a stone at her. He went back to writing. Caleb watched the faces of the accusers. He saw the anger falter, replaced by a sudden, inward panic. He saw the oldest man, a bearded scribe with hard eyes, look at the rock in his hand. The man's grip loosened. The stone fell. Thud. It was a small sound, but it echoed like a thunderclap in the courtyard. Thud. Another stone dropped. Thud. One by one, the wall of accusers crumbled. They turned and melted into the crowd. Defeated not by an argument, but by a mirror. Soon, only the woman and Jesus remained. And Caleb, watching from the pillar. Jesus stood up. He looked at the woman, who was curled in a ball, waiting for the blow that never came. Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? She looked up. Her eyes wide, disbelief warring with hope. No one, sir. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus said. Go now and leave your life of sin. As the woman scrambled away, weeping, Jesus turned. His eyes found Caleb in the shadows. He didn't speak, but the look was clear. I take the stones from their hands, the eyes said. Will you let me take the stones from your heart? Caleb looked down at his own hands. They were clenched into fists. Slowly, painfully, he opened them. News came from Bethany 3 days later. Lazarus was sick. Then, Lazarus was dead. Caleb knew the sister, Martha. She was a woman of practicalities, much like himself. When they arrived at the village, 4 days too late, the sound of professional mourners filled the air. A high grated on Caleb's nerves. It was the sound of finality. He knew this sound. He had made it himself. When they pulled Sarah from the rubble, he watched Jesus. The teacher was agitated. His spirit seemed troubled. A storm brewing behind his eyes. When Mary fell at his feet, weeping, saying, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Caleb felt a spike of bitterness. Where were you? You heal strangers. You stop mobs. But when your friend dies, you are 4 days late. Death is the one wall you cannot breach. Mason. Jesus asked to be taken to the tomb. It was a cave, sealed with a massive stone. Caleb assessed the weight of it instantly. 2 tons, he calculated, maybe 3. It would take 5 men, with levers to move it. Take away the stone, Jesus commanded. Martha gasped, "Lord, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there for days." "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" Jesus replied. His voice was strained, thick with emotion. Caleb stepped forward. He didn't do it for faith. He did it because he knew how to move stone. He signaled to 3 other men. They wedged their shoulders against the rock. "Push," Caleb grunted. The stone ground against the earth, a harsh, scraping scream. The seal was broken. A wave of stale, cold air rushed out, the smell of decay and spices. Caleb turned his face away, the memory of his own wife's death choking him. This is foolishness, he thought. Jesus stood before the black maw of the cave. He looked small against the darkness. He looked at the sky, whispered a prayer that Caleb couldn't hear, and then took a breath. "Lazarus." The shout was guttural. It wasn't a request. It was a command shouted into the throat of the abyss. "Come out." Silence. The birds had stopped singing. The mourners had stopped wailing. The world held its breath. Caleb stared into the dark, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Don't do this," he begged silently. "Let the dead stay dead. Don't give us false hope." Movement. In the shadows. Something white shifted. Caleb stepped back, his boot catching on a root. He grabbed a sapling to steady himself. A figure shuffled into the shaft of sunlight. It was bound in linen wrappings, face covered by a cloth. A scream tore through the jerky gait, not a man who had forgotten how to use his knees. Unadulterated shock. "Take off the grave clothes, and let him go," Jesus said. His voice was exhausted, as if the life that had flowed into Lazarus had been drained from him. Caleb watched as they unwrapped the man. He saw the chest heave with breath. He saw the color return to gray skin. He looked at Jesus. The teacher was leaning against a tree, wiping sweat from his brow. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man who had just paid a terrible price. Caleb realized then, with a jolt that nearly brought him to his knees, that the balance of the world had shifted. He traded, Caleb thought. He didn't just fix the wall. He became the support beam. Caleb approached Jesus. The crowd was swarming Lazarus, but Caleb had eyes only for the teacher. "You brought him back," Caleb whispered. Jesus looked at him. The eyes were ancient, filled with the knowledge of what was coming. "I am the resurrection and the life," Jesus said softly. "The one who believes in me will live." "And the one who is already dead?" Caleb asked, his voice breaking. "The one who died inside 5 years ago." Jesus reached out and touched Caleb's chest, right over his heart. "That house can be rebuilt, Caleb, but the old foundation must be cleared away first." Jesus looked toward Jerusalem, visible as a haze on the horizon. "We go to the city now," Jesus said. "The work is almost finished." Caleb nodded. He didn't understand everything. The theology, the prophecies, the kingdom. But he understood construction. He understood that before a new structure could rise, there had to be a demolition. He just didn't realize yet that the demolition would be of the man standing in front of him. "I will carry your bag," Caleb said. He picked up the small sack of belongings Jesus had left on the ground. It was light, but as they turned toward Jerusalem, it felt heavier than the two-tone stone. Jerusalem during the Passover was a powder keg, and Thursday night was the match. Caleb sat near the doorway of the upper room, the air heavy with the scent of roasted lamb and bitter herbs. The meal had been strange, thick with unspoken farewells. The teacher had washed their feet, an act so humbling it made Caleb's skin crawl. With discomfort, a master did not serve the laborer. It disturbed the natural order of things. When they left for the olive grove, across the Kidron Valley, the night air was cold. The moon hung full and pale, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and grasp. In the Garden of Gethsemane, the olive trees twisted from the rocky ground, like tortured limbs. The silence here was different than the desert. It was expectant. "Sit here," Jesus said to the main group, his voice brittle. He took Peter, James, and John deeper into the shadows. Caleb remained on the periphery. He leaned against an ancient olive trunk, its bark rough against his spine. He watched the inner circle. He saw the teacher fall to the ground, not in prayer, but in collapse. He heard sounds he never wanted to hear again. Low, agonizing groans of a spirit, being crushed under an invisible weight. Caleb understood stress loads. He knew how much weight a cedar beam could take before it splintered. Tonight, he was watching a soul, bearing the weight of a collapsing world. The disciples slept. Their grief had exhausted them. Caleb did not sleep. He kept watch, his hand near the small hammer in his belt. He was a builder. He knew that when the structure groaned, you didn't close your eyes. Then came the light. Torches snaked up the pathway from the city, like a line of fiery insects. The sound of marching feet, the jingle of Roman harness, the hushed whispers of the temple guard. And at the front, Judas, the treasurer, the one with the shifting eyes. Caleb stood up, muscles coiled. The betrayal happened quickly, a kiss in the dark that felt colder than a dagger thrust. Chaos erupted. Peter, wild-eyed, drew a sword and swung clumsily, slicing an ear. "Put your sword back into its place," Jesus commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. Even now, bound and surrounded, he was the center of gravity. He touched the servant's bleeding head, the flesh knit. The last miracle, Caleb thought numbly, and wasted on an enemy. The guards seized Jesus. The disciples scattered like rats. When a granary collapses, Caleb didn't run, but he didn't fight either. He stood frozen against the tree, watching them drag the foundation away into the dark. The garden was empty again, save for the smell of crushed olives and fear. Caleb followed at a distance. He followed the torches to the high priest's courtyard. He stayed in the deepest shadows, watching the farce of a trial through gaps in the crowd. He saw the spitting, he heard the slaps, meat striking meat. He heard the lies, stacked one upon another, like poorly laid bricks. And he saw Jesus, silent, a basalt column in a hurricane, immovable. As dawn bleached the sky gray, Caleb saw Peter by the firelight, his face crumbling as a rooster crowed. The strongest beam had just snapped. Caleb turned away. He couldn't watch anymore. The weight was too much. The demolition had begun. By mid-morning, the air outside the city walls smelled of blood and vinegar. Caleb stood on a limestone ridge, overlooking the place they called the Skull. He was far enough away that the faces were indistinct, but close enough to hear the sounds. He was a man who worked with iron and stone. He knew the sound of a hammer driving metal. Clang. Caleb flinched. It was a wet, dull sound. Iron driving through flesh into wood. Clang. He closed his eyes, but the darkness behind his lids was filled with the image of Sarah under the beam. This was worse. This was a slow dismantling of a human being. They lifted the cross. It jerked upright, dropping into the socket hole, with a thud that shuddered through the ground. The vibration traveled up through Caleb's boots. He watched for 6 hours. He watched the slow, agonizing suffocation. He watched the soldiers gamble for the seamless tunic, the one with dust on the hem. At noon, the sun failed. It wasn't a cloud. It was as if the eye of God had closed. A suffocating darkness fell over the land, cold and absolute. The crowd on the hill fell silent. The jeering stopped. In the unnatural twilight, Caleb fixed his eyes on the pale figure against the dark wood. He saw the chest heave, the struggle for air becoming desperate. Then came the cry. It wasn't a scream of defeat. It was a shout of completion. It is finished. The earth answered. The ridge under Caleb's feet buckled. He fell to his knees, grasping the shifting soil. Rocks split open with the sound of cannon fire. The world tore at the seams. Caleb pressed his face into the dirt, covering his head with his arms. Waiting for the final collapse, waiting for the sky to fall, as his roof once had. He is dead. The earth seemed to groan. The foundation has cracked. When the shaking stopped, and the darkness lifted into bruised twilight, Caleb looked toward the hill. The center cross carried only a corpse. He stood up, shaking the dust from his clothes. He felt utterly hollowed out. The cynicism returned, colder and harder than before. You promised a kingdom, Caleb whispered toward the silent cross. You built only a ruin. He turned his back on Golgotha and walked toward the wilderness. He could not go back to the city of murderers. He could not return to the empty tomb of his discipleship. He went to find a place where the rocks were already broken, where nothing else could fall on him. Saturday was a void, a day of silence so profound, it felt like a physical weight pressing on Caleb's chest. He sat in a shallow cave in the hills, staring at nothing. He didn't eat, he didn't drink, he simply existed, in the aftermath of the demolition. Then came Sunday morning, the first day of the week. The air was cool, damp with dew. The sky shifted from black to hesitant rose. Caleb gathered brush for a small fire, purely out of habit, when he felt the change. The birds had stopped singing, just as they had at Lazarus's tomb. There were no footsteps, there was only a presence. Caleb froze, a bundle of thorns in his arms. He did not want to turn. If it was a soldier, let him strike. If a ghost, let it pass. Caleb? The voice was not a ghost's. It had soil and wood, and life in it. Slowly, terrified of hope, Caleb turned. He was standing there, solid, real, wearing simple clothes, like a gardener's. The exhaustion was gone, the sorrow smoothed away. He looked like the first morning of the world. Caleb dropped the thorns. He could not speak. Jesus walked toward him, without pain, without strain. You have gone back to the rubble, Jesus said gently. It is all I know, Caleb rasped. You died. The stone beat the builder. Jesus held out his hands. In the center of the palms were ragged scars, healed but permanent. The stone did its worst. Jesus said it broke the body. It could not hold the life. He placed Caleb's hand over the scar on his wrist. Beneath the ruined tissue was a strong, steady pulse. The old foundation is gone, Jesus whispered, buried in my tomb. Caleb fell to his knees. He did not weep, he simply rested. My house fell, Caleb confessed. I killed her. A hand rested on his head, heavy, warm, forgiving. Now you will build, with living stones, Jesus said, a house death cannot enter. Go back to Jerusalem, find your brothers. Tell them, the master builder has finished the work. And then, Caleb asked. Jesus smiled, the smile of someone who knew a wonderful secret. And then, we begin to build the new city. Jesus turned, walking back toward humanity. Caleb watched until he vanished. Around the bend, the sun rose over the hills, bathing the land in gold. Caleb lifted a stone. It was heavy, but it did not frighten him. For the first time in 5 years, he felt the strength to lift it, and knew where it belonged. He turned toward Jerusalem, and began to walk. He had a message to deliver, and after that, a great deal of building to do.